Well, so of course you're right to point out that, the Czech nation was carving its place in the context of the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? So carving out its place within that multinational empire. But of course, then that empire collapses at the end of the First World War, and then you do have Germany as the predominant power in Central Europe. And so now I want to I want to try to make a link between this period and the present, right? So, then of course you have the rise of Nazism, Hitler coming to power, and a very, extreme ethnic nationalism, right? And again, you've written about this period. So, part of how Hitler justified first the annexation of the Sudetenland, right, in 1938, shortly followed by the invasion and the annexation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. Part of how Hitler justified that was on the basis that Czechoslovakia was and Czechoslovakia, of course, created in 1918 from the ruins of the Habsburg Empire, that this was not a real nation, right? The Czechs were not a real nation. These were historically German lands, right, populated by Germans. And, to bring it to the present, I also, I want to ask you whether you see parallels between this kind of language and rhetoric and the kind of language and rhetoric that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, uses about Ukraine, right? This is not a real nation. These are not real people. This is Russian land, Russian people.
There are very clear parallels. I mean, it's interesting that if you look at the recent history of Ukraine and the recent history, and the history of Czechoslovakia after the First World War, what you have is a dramatic event that led to a change in the status quo. Here, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led to the creation of Czechoslovakia. Yes. With Ukraine came into being because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes. And there was a new reality that was created. And of course, what happened was, for most Czechs, this was seen as a process of national emancipation. And Czechoslovakia, it's true, of course, that there isn't a Czechoslovak nation. Mm-hmm. There was an attempt in the 1920s and 1930s to suggest that there was. But on the other hand, to suggest that Czechs and the Czech nation were in some way German is quite simply wrong. This country has an immensely complex and interesting and fascinating history, which is predominantly Slav, but also has a German element, also has a Jewish element, also has all sorts of other bits and pieces. Half the Baroque buildings in Prague were built and designed by Italians. This is a place, a crossroads in Europe, where it has many, many different influences. And it's the same with Ukraine as well, that you have a country which has a very rich and complex history, which is closely connected with Russia, but also had centuries of history that were part of had other influences, such as Poland, Lithuania, Austria. There are many different nations within Ukraine, the territory of today's Ukraine. There's the Hungarian minority, Bulgarians, Romanians, Jews. There are so many different elements that make up today's Ukraine. And what we also see that's similar between the 1930s here and today in Ukraine is that you see this, the more powerful neighboring country, Russia now, yes, Germany then, suddenly or gradually becoming increasingly authoritarian, increasingly ultra-nationalist, and inventing a simplifying agenda, national agenda, saying history is this. History isn't the complexities that make up the relationships between nations, but history is this. If the reality on the ground is different, that's because history has gone wrong, and we have to put it right.
So we have to put it on the correct path.
And in order to put it on the correct path, we either have to change the minds of people by changing their mindset, by whatever ways we choose, or we have to do it by creating new realities on the ground, which is what both Hitler and President Putin did. Hitler by annexing Austria and then the Sudetenland and then occupying the whole of this country, or the whole of Bohemia and Moravia, and Vladimir Putin by firstly annexing Crimea and eastern parts of eastern Ukraine, and then trying to invade the whole country. There are direct parallels, and I think we should be very clear in stressing that and stressing the immense dangers that come out of that, and we're already seeing it in the many thousands of people who are being killed at the moment in Ukraine because of a false idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right to point out that the reality, the historical reality in truth is complexity, right? Complexity and nuance, because unfortunately, I think there can be a tendency that a lot of people want a simple narrative, right? So then this becomes a kind of an effective tool.
And it's also interesting that, I mean, that the Czechs, there was always a rivalry between the Czech and the German languages and between Czechs and Germans, although it's complicated because this was Austria, it wasn't Germany. But it was always within certain limits. And in the same way, I mean, Russia is not Ukraine's traditional enemy. If you look at the history of the 20th century, Ukraine had a far more problematic and violent relationship with Poland than with Russia. And yet, what happens is if somebody comes with an agenda which is ultra-nationalistic and doesn't accommodate these similarities and differences, then you have no choice but to reject it. And that's what happened with in Czechoslovakia. It's also one of the impulses for the tragedy of what happened to the German minority in Czechoslovakia after the Second World War, that the Czechs said no more. And
they were essentially expelled.
Expelled them in ways that were often very brutal.
Yes.
Depending on how things develop in Ukraine, I mean, there's a real danger as well that there will be a huge backlash against the Russian language and against people who maybe identify themselves culturally as Russian, but not necessarily politically. And that's something. What place will they have in the future Ukraine if Ukraine wins the war? Which I mean, I think we all just have to be doing our best to help Ukraine to win this war.